to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, the podcast that features conversations with writers of all types. Today's episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books has been sponsored by Babo Botanicals, B-A-B-O Botanicals. Babo Botanicals offers your family non-toxic and pure hair, skin, and sun solutions created with effective natural or organic ingredients. You can buy their products on Amazon or check them out at babobotanicals.com. I'm here today with Andrea Petersen. Andrea is a contributing writer at the Wall Street Journal and the author of the book On Edge, A Journey Through Anxiety. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and her 9-year-old daughter. So welcome to Andrea.
Thanks for having me.
So you share in your book that you've spent your life since sophomore year in college coping with serious anxiety disorder involving panic attacks and some other debilitating symptoms, which I really want to talk about. But I also really want to talk about your recent Wall Street Journal article, The Overprotected American Child, which outlined how to prevent anxiety from forming in children, assuming genetics don't doom them from the outset with their parents. But so let's start with the article, if that's okay.
Sure.
You began by sharing your experience when you left your daughter at home for a few minutes for the first time and how you both felt, quote, a bit rattled by the whole thing afterwards. Can you tell me more about that situation and how your feelings afterwards made you think about parenting in order to prevent anxiety?
Well, because I've done so much research on anxiety and particularly how anxiety develops in kids, I've done looked into sort of how much parenting can or cannot contribute to anxiety. And the good news is that, most researchers don't believe that parenting necessarily makes kids anxious. But if you
okay, you can go home now.
but if you have an anxious kid or a kid who's kind of predisposed to anxiety, what you do does really matter. And the parenting, and this is actually true for all kids. So the one sort of parenting dimension that seems to actually carry the most weight and maybe do the most harm when it comes to actually making kids anxious is not giving them enough autonomy. And, I've also kind of read so much. I think we've all read sort of a lot of hand-wringing stories and essays about, lamenting the fact that kids today don't have nearly as much independence, physical independence and autonomy as, I'm a Gen Xer, as I did, and certainly generations before us did. I don't know about you, but I remember long, especially summer days, kind of playing tag, riding my bike with like a gang of other kids, no parents in sight. And that is certainly not the way my daughter is growing up. And, I've been thinking for months, I really need to start giving her a little bit more independence and autonomy, because I know that is one of the things that I can do to sort of not only just make sure, try to prevent anxiety, but also, you don't want to, I've talked to psychologists who say, they've got kids that are off at college whose parents still call them every morning to wake them up because they've never learned to wake up on their own. Kids who don't know how to do their laundry, who, we just as parents, because I think we're so focused on the homework and the extracurricular activities, and they're so sort of scheduled and busy that I think we forget to teach them a lot of the sort of basic life skills that they're going to need when they're on their own. So this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and of course, I didn't actually do it until I sort of had to.
Right.
What happened is my daughter was really sick and my husband was out of town and I needed to go actually get her Pedialyte because she just couldn't keep anything down. And so I decided, I kind of calculated the time. The drugstore was about a 5-minute walk away. And I'm like, okay, it'll take me about 10 minutes so I can probably do the whole thing in 20 minutes. And I basically I showed her where the landline was, which is, I don't even think she knew where it was because we don't ever use it, so she could call me, quizzed her, made sure that she knew my cell phone number, but I, kind of quizzed her on it to make sure that it was top of mind, told her not to open the door for anyone. And then I left. And
you put her in front of the TV, or you did not?
No, I didn't. I was like, she's a big reader, so she's super into Harry Potter now. So I think, she was enwrapped in one of those books. But it's funny, I got in line at the store and my phone rang and it was FaceTime. And she said, Mama, the landline didn't work. So I guess I don't know if something was wrong with it, that it didn't work. No. But she was intrepid enough to figure out how to call me on my iPad and FaceTime me that way. So we did she was a little nervous. And so she FaceTimed me and we chatted for a bit. And, so I got home, and we both emerged unscathed from the whole ordeal. Until I told my husband actually that night what I had done, and he was not so thrilled about it. He was like, she could have choked on something or hurt her, bumped her head. And I mean, to be fair to him, those things have actually happened, of course, when we were actually home with her. So, sometimes even if you want to encourage, independence and autonomy in your kids, it can be hard to, if your spouse isn't on board with it,
right,
that can be tough. Or especially if your neighborhood isn't. I mean, I've talked to several parents who wanted to have their kids walk to school at 9 or 8 or 9, and came under fire from other parents who thought that was just a nutty idea.
I mean, everybody does it a little differently.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. You mentioned also in your article that overzealous parenting can do real harm, which is sort of, what you're talking about now with sort of anti-autonomy. And that doctors cite this as a contributing factor in the increase of the prevalence of anxiety disorders among kids. So can the parenting cause it, or is it just what you were saying, more on the fringes, it can lead to a sort of a flare-up of it?
I mean, I don't think anyone's totally parsed it out. I think what I've heard from everyone from college counseling center directors who are seeing huge explosions. I mean, the statistics are actually, especially among young adults, college students, are alarming. The latest research shows that about 22% of college students in 2017 said that they had been treated for or diagnosed with anxiety problems within the last year. And that's up from 10% in 2008. So there's clearly something going on. I mean, definitely it's being fueled partly by the fact that there's more awareness and around having mental health issues, and there's less stigma, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. But, there's clearly something going on, and psychologists and educators do point to sort of overzealous parenting as one sort of contributing factor. And if you think about it, it makes sense because, when you are overprotective or don't give kids sort of age-appropriate autonomy, I mean, the message that you're sending to them is that the world's a dangerous place, mm-hmm. and that they can't cope with situations on their own.
Right.
And you're also not giving them the chance to develop the skills that they're going to need. I mean, ideally, we all want our kids to be independent and be able to live on their own.
That would be nice.
When they graduate from high school and go to college or go to the workforce, we want them to be able to have those skills that they're going to need to sort of live independently.
So what are the tips you had said in your article? Getting people to do getting your kids to do household chores is really helpful. Things like the laundry and the dishes. What else should you be having your kids do?
Well, that was actually really eye-opening for me, because when I initially approached the story, I was thinking, okay, I know that I want to give my daughter more independence, but I feel like for our parents' generation, it was just sort of, I mean, that's what everyone did. Right. So it was just, because they kind of went with their gut, or they just went with whatever the prevailing, the cultural tide was. But things are so different now, and people are so much more, I think, anxious about, giving their kids more, whether it's because, we all hear about the child abduction that may have happened, across the country. And, statistically, kids are much safer than they were when people, Gen Xers, were kids. But even so, I think we hear more about the scary things that can happen. So I wanted to find out, okay, what does the research say? Like, if I do want to give my daughter independence and autonomy, what age is the right age to let her walk to school by herself or stay home alone or whatever? And, I didn't really find a lot of sort of hard, fast rules, but what was really interesting to me is talking to psychologists. They were actually saying, you really need to think about independence and autonomy, not so much in the context of these sort of big, kind of riskier sort of independence moves, but more as a continuum, starting when they're really small, and things that we would think of as sort of chores or duties, like having your 2-year-old put their dirty clothes in the hamper, or pick up their toys, or having your 6-year-old make a sandwich, mm-hmm. not with a sharp knife, with a dull knife. They're mm-hmm. not ready for, or your 8-year-old make some scrambled eggs on a stove. Like, those may sound just like chores, but in fact, those are moves towards independence, because they are skills that they're going to need to have, skills that they're going to need to have to sort of live self-sufficiently. And they give them a feeling of self-efficacy, that they can do it. And that is a really important skill to have. And also another tip that was really interesting was actually to involve the kids in decision-making around their moves toward independence and autonomy. So if you are talking about do you think, just asking your child, do you think you're ready to stay home alone? And what are the pros and cons of that? And actually having that discussion with them, you're helping to really encourage their decision-making skills. And that is something, and to help them feel sort of confident that they can kind of work through these kind of things. And that actually is a really important skill to have, and to help them sort of and you're also conveying that you trust them to help problem solve. So they're learning problem solving skills. They're learning to trust their own thinking. And so if you think about that, that's going to be really important when they start facing, especially during the teen years, when they're facing bigger decisions about, sex and alcohol and scary things like that. So, it's those are things that you can really help sort of develop that good decision making from these smaller sort of independence moves.
I love these tips, especially because you can do them at home. It's not like I have to go let my kids start wandering around the street.
Right, exactly.
These are just everyday things. I mean, many of which the kids do, but just to make it, to be so mindful of it and make sure that they know why they're doing it too, that it's beneficial for them.
Right. Like you're going to need to know how to do this, because at some point you're going to live on your own, and I'm not going to be here to do your laundry. So, or things like that.
I just visited a girlfriend of mine recently who lives outside of Boston. She has 4 kids, and she was showing us the laundry room, and she was like, oh yeah, the kids do all their own laundry. She has some little kids. I was like, really? She's like, oh yeah. She's like, I mean, maybe the big load, if there's something I have to do, I'll do it. But when the kids are like, my socks are dirty, or I need this cleaned for soccer, she's like, that's where it is. So,
that's great. See, yeah. I definitely...
I do not do that.
I have not done that yet. And actually there's things, I until recently was making my daughter her breakfast. And I'm like, because I have one child too. So it's one of those, so it's not, I think the more kids you have, probably the more likely you are to have, you just don't have as much time. But I think...
I don't know. I was like a short order cook in the kitchen
all right,
this morning. I'm like 3 lunch boxes open for camp and making eggs, right. And I was like, I can't keep this that much longer.
Yeah. So, and then that was but also talking to another psychologist was really eye-opening too. Things that I hadn't really thought of as independence moves, but of course they are, and I wouldn't have thought of because basically she was saying you have to keep remembering that. The goal is to have sort of a self-sufficient person by the time they leave your roof. And, things like advocating for themselves with teachers, that's a really important skill, so they'll, in college, they'll be able to develop relationships with mentors, and they'll be able to negotiate, if they bomb a test, that they know that they can go into a professor and, figure out what they need to do to get better, to get a better grade on the next one, so that, you're not, they're not failing out before they address it, or going to the doctor by themselves, and being able to talk about their own symptoms. I mean, one psychologist was telling me she's had kids, end up with pneumonia because they'd never had the experience of they were just, I guess, too sort of overwhelmed to go and make their own doctor's appointment.
Wow. I can't imagine my kids picking up the phone and making all their own doctor's appointments, at this age at least, but it's nice to know that'll come.
Yeah.
Take a little bit off my plate, I guess. Let's switch gears a little bit to the book, which is so good.
Thank you.
So you talk in your book about how you've approached the treatment to your own anxiety. And I loved your description of when you had acupuncture and you were like, and all the alternative treatments. Like, I personally have never felt as anxious as being left alone in a dark room with needles all over me. And your description was just hilarious. I love that.
There's actually something called relaxation-induced anxiety, So
Totally. I have the hardest time relaxing. It's like yoga, like all those things you're supposed to do.
Oh, I've had panic attacks in the middle of massages.
Oh, good.
So
I feel
when my
better.
anxiety is like really, really amped up,
Yeah.
the act of trying to relax and actually focusing on my body
Yep.
can actually cause a resurgence in symptoms.
Interesting.
But I mean that, I do find all those things. There is actually evidence that acupuncture can be very helpful,
sure,
and it
I
can be
know.
for some
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Yoga is actually one of the ways that I think helps keep my anxiety in check when it's at sort of its lower kind of typical kind of low hum.
Okay.
But when it's super amped up, there's other things I've got to do.
Interesting. Oh, so what are some of the things that you do when you're really amped up?
I mean, when my anxiety is disabling, when it's really preventing me from...
And can you just describe to listeners, you did such a good job in your book of describing some of the symptoms and just sort of what a bad anxiety day might look like for you?
Yeah. I mean, for me...
And in the past, too.
For me, I've had... Anxiety for me has taken many, many forms, but when it was really at its worst, I mean, I was having panic attacks, which are these incredibly intense episodes of... really serious sort of physical symptoms. Like I actually felt like I was dying. My heart was racing, short of breath, strange visual changes, and this feeling of overwhelming doom that I was about to die or go crazy. And a panic attack is supposed to sort of peak and abate within about 10 minutes. But, I had this college sort of breakdown where it felt like about a month-long panic attack. I mean, yes, my fear had sort of peaks and valleys, but it basically left me totally incapacitated, sort of a lump on my parents' sofa. I had to drop my classes. I couldn't take my finals. I had to sort of withdraw from school for a little bit. It was kind of a whole body illness. And unfortunately, I wasn't accurately diagnosed for about a year. I ended up having some sort of medical odyssey because I'd like to think that wouldn't happen now, that doctors are a little bit more aware of the symptoms of anxiety. But from the research that I've seen, that still people with anxiety, often it's 10 years or more before their onset of symptoms to when they actually get professional help. So crazy. There's still a long way to go.
Do you have any advice for listeners out there who struggle with anxiety themselves? You had this beautiful essay that you wrote in the Oprah magazine when you kept confusing the name. You were playing with your daughter, like pretend sisters, and you couldn't remember the name of the pretend character you were supposed to be because your mind was on 100 other things, which I know I can relate to. I'm sure other people too. So how can you just stay more in the moment without having to run to a yoga class? How do you,
Right.
when you're in it, how do you try to keep the anxiety at bay enough to be focused? Because by the end of the article, you kind of had a moment where you figured out what to do.
Well, if anxiety rises to a disorder when it's really impairing your life, when it's preventing you from working, being present in your relationships, when it's really that's when you need to go get help. And the two most evidence-based treatments for anxiety disorders are cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a kind of talk therapy where you learn to sort of these catastrophic thoughts that we have when we're anxious. You learn to sort of modify them, and also the main component for of the treatment is actually exposure, where you kind of repeatedly expose yourself to the very things that you're afraid of. And it's fairly effective. Also, antidepressant medications like Lexapro and Zoloft and things like that have also been shown to be helpful, though the evidence for them is a little bit not as strong as people would like to me. I also talk a lot about in the book about some of the really exciting new science that's sort of unraveling some of the mysteries of the anxious brain, and some of the new treatments on the horizon that actually aim to sort of to directly address some of the underlying cognitions that underlie anxiety, but also some of the what's kind of wrong, what's kind of wonky in the brain too. So there's a lot of exciting stuff around that. But then just when anxiety, if it doesn't rise to a disorder, if it's sort of, or you're trying to prevent a relapse, if you do struggle with an anxiety disorder, a lot of the really boring adult things that we're all supposed to do, that we all know we're supposed to do, like get enough sleep, exercise. I mean, those are really critical for people with anxiety. There's a whole robust body of research that shows that insufficient sleep in particular is a really great way to, put your anxiety on overdrive. And also, that exercise, particularly things like yoga, anything that kind of ground yourself in the present moment. I mean, if you think about it, so mindfulness meditation, there's a lot of great research around that. But really, what I found, anything that can ground myself in the present moment is really helpful, because if you think about it, anxiety is sort of the antithesis of that. It's all about the future. It's all about the catastrophe around the corner. So if you can stay in the moment, that's really sort of the antidote to anxiety. And it can be different for, if you're not into meditation. I'm actually not that great at it. I do try, but I talked to several people listening to music or taking a walk, or, I actually find baking is one of my favorite sort of soothing activities.
I'm totally with you. That's one of my favorites.
There's something about sort of following a recipe and sort of the tactile nature of it. And then I just kind of get lost in that process, and it really sort of settles my mind. There's research showing that actually, taking a walk in nature can be really, really helpful. And
probably writing.
No, not for me.
Not for you?
I find writing can be very anxiety inducing.
Really?
Yes, especially when I'm on deadline.
Okay.
I'm always because it's this sort of battle between, the deadline and this sort of anxiety about putting sort of, not being able to express myself. Always that feeling of inadequacy that I think a lot of us writers have is, what we hope to create maybe doesn't always jive with what we actually end up creating.
So you don't use writing for yourself, like as a tool to sort through feelings or anything? Is it mostly...
No. It's always, I love it. And I find in a lot of ways anxiety has fueled my work. This worry about, first of all, when I was a news reporter, getting beaten on a story, that,
right,
but also just the fear of messing up. I mean, this fear that I would make a mistake. It was very motivating to double check, triple check my work, do one more interview. I mean, in ways, sort of paranoia can be a very useful quality in a journalist. I find.
See, I think at least with writing, not that I do what you do, but you're so in control of it, right? Like you're in control of what you produce and every word. And if you want to fix it later, you go back, you fix it. I mean, not after you send it to the Wall Street Journal, but before that stage, it's different than if you're, I would imagine, like I was just chatting with two girlfriends who are, have been on air, right? Like
right,
reporter.
Yeah.
Like, you can't take anything back, right? That's like live TV,
Right.
I mean, not that anyway.
Yeah.
And what you said, by the way, about sleep being a leading, like not getting enough sleep, really amping up anxiety, that's so not fair, especially for parents of young kids who I don't know about you, I have kids in my room basically. I mean, it's getting better, but there's somebody coming in usually most nights, at least once. And especially with new kids, like when you had a new baby, like sleep is impossible. It's just not even in the cards.
Oh, new parenthood, I think, is just sort of it's not only is the sleep deprivation a reality, but in some ways, society is telling you to be anxious. I mean, we're awash in parenting advice, and the parenting advice can change all the time. And I think it's just, in some ways, when I talk about having my daughter and when she was a new baby, that I finally felt like my circumstances, kind of caught up with my brain. I always had this anxious brain, and now finally it was actually sort of socially acceptable, if not socially mandated, that I'd be anxious all the time.
Somebody, who was it? I can't remember. Somebody was on the show recently and saying they never were anxious until they had a child, and then for the first time they're like, "Oh my gosh, I can't cross the street," and that feeling of anxiety was so brand new that it was like shocking both to her and her husband that all of a sudden she was that way.
Right. And I think we spent so many years, protecting, and that's why I think this idea going back to autonomy and independence, it can be very difficult to then be like, oh well, actually the right thing to do for my child now is to actually sort of trying to get them to be more independent, and that's sort of the parenting kind of mission, maybe. So,
kids, if you're listening, right? I'm not doing anything for you anymore. That's it. Pack my bags for me. And what was the process of writing the book like for you?
It was really intense, and it was also because as being a news reporter for so many years, I really hadn't. I'd written maybe a couple of first person pieces, so writing something so personal was a real shift for me, and something that was tough. I mean, I had to, and I basically, how I kind of went about it is I told myself that no one else was going to read it. I basically decided that I tried to turn off that self-editor, and also that my family wasn't going to read it either, because I figured I also, which of course, ultimately, yes, obviously people read it, but in order to write as authentically and honestly as I wanted to, I had to sort of try to trick myself into thinking that I was only writing it for myself.
That's a good trick.
And then I could tell myself, well, I could always, tone it down or ratchet it back or delete some things if I felt like I needed to. And actually, I didn't end up having to do that much, because especially with something like a memoir, I think you really have to put yourself out there in order for it to resonate with anyone else. And I wanted to, for this book in particular, I wanted to provide, insight and empathy to all the other anxious people out there too. And I'm hoping that some people might see similarities and differences, but that my story would resonate with people.
It certainly resonated with me, and I also loved you included so much research, but you weaved it throughout the text in such a nice way. Weaved it through it, that you almost didn't notice that you were like reading a textbook about anxiety while you're reading somebody's story.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly hope it didn't read like
no,
a
it
textbook.
No, I meant that you conveyed as much information as you might have found in a textbook. However, it was a story, and you wanted to keep reading because I wanted to see what happened to you next, and what about the next boyfriend, and then what had happened to her job. And anyway, I was like, it's so funny how we just, I'm in bed reading about you and your entire life and everything, and then we meet in person, and I'm like, well, I already know all that stuff about you.
I know. I always, especially after people who have known me for a long time, but maybe don't know about this kind of part of my life so much, now you know more about me than you ever wanted to know. But
no, but that's what connection's all about, right?
Yeah.
That's how you. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's actually been one of the most exciting things about going around speaking about the book and traveling all over is having people come up and tell me some of their own stories too. So I feel like we've got this sort of kind of group of anxiety warriors all out there.
Oh, that's nice.
Kind of supporting each other.
I'm gonna start a new hashtag. Anxiety warrior. Hashtag anxiety warrior. And what's coming up next for you? What are you going to do next? You have another book, more Wall Street Journal?
I'm working on a bunch more pieces, so it's been fun to actually get back sort of into. I'm a feature writer, so I don't write daily journalism, but having being out there with pieces more frequently. Also, we're taking a little bit of a sojourn. My husband's a professor, so we're going to be in Ireland this summer. So that'll be fun, and so I'll be doing writing from there while he's doing research. And I do have another book idea that I'm sort of noodling around on.
So for people who love anxious people, like someone like my husband, let's say, who has to deal with me, what advice do you have for them? How can they help people who they love who have anxiety?
That's a great question, and it's actually one that I get almost every time I speak about the book. And it actually depends. I guess the biggest thing you can do, first of all, the most important thing is to really believe and convey the belief that you understand that anxiety is not a weakness. It's not a moral failing. I think, unfortunately, even with how far we've come in eroding stigma, that sort of view is still out there, and that, if only you worked a little harder or took a yoga class or took some deep breaths, that you just relax, that you wouldn't deal with it. So I think, conveying this sort of love and acceptance is sort of the biggest gift you can give someone with anxiety. And then beyond that, everyone's different in terms of how they want someone to support them in the moment when they're really feeling like, if they're having a panic attack or if they're just, feeling really, really anxious. For me, when I'm having a panic attack, I want my husband to hold my hand, but I don't want him to talk to me. So I think the most important thing is to ask the person that you love, what can I do for you in that moment that will be helpful? Is it rub your back? Is it, go to put on some music? What does that person need in that moment?
Okay, that helps. Thank you. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks
for
so much for
sharing
having
your
me.
story
Thanks
with the world and other warriors. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. This episode was sponsored by Baba Botanicals.